Welcome to This Week in Impact, where ImpactAlpha editor David Bank and I break down some of the most interesting impact investing stories of the week. I'm Brian Walsh. It's Thursday, July 4th. Happy Independence Day to those who celebrate. This week we'll put out the patriotic bunting, cue up some John Philip Sousa marches, and reflect on the vibe shifts that we're living through. David and I will discuss the implications of this term's Supreme Court rulings on the business environment for sustainable finance, how impact investors are preparing for the political risk of the upcoming U.S. presidential elections, and how a nonprofit housing developer looks to drive community homeownership without displacement in Baltimore. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Welcome back from vacation. How was your time off?
Hey, Brian, it was always good, but I came back to a full plate.
Indeed, and full plate, but also somewhat of a short week. So happy 4th of July to you. How are you celebrating?
Well, we're going to have the classic backyard barbecue. I think we may actually have a cleared evening here in the Bay Area without the coastal fog, so we might actually get to see some fireworks.
Well, speaking of fireworks, while you were off, the Supreme Court came down with some historic end-of-term rulings, which will have wide ramifications for democracy and civic institutions for years to come. While the ruling on substantial presidential immunity has gained the most headlines and concerns among fans of democracy, we wanted to instead focus on some of the rulings that will directly impact the regulatory environment in which investors and businesses operate. Now, David, there were three opinions that amount to a wholesale reimagining of the power and operation of the administrative state, which has been a decades-long objective of the conservative legal movement. Before we dig into the details and the implications, what is meant by the administrative state?
Well, it's become, as you said, it's kind of weaponized, but it's really just a simple description of kind of how the federal government has operated, at least I think since the New Deal. And I'm not no historian of all that, but the notion is that, Congress passes laws with broad intentions and budget numbers, but somebody's got to actually interpret and implement these laws, and that's what folks call regulations. And you can decry regulations, but it's the kind of thing that keeps the water clean, keeps workplaces safe, keeps the meat inspected, and those are all kind of federal agencies that interpret the laws that Congress passes and puts them into effect. And what the main decision that you mentioned, it's called Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, basically changed the way that those kinds of court challenges to those kinds of administrative decisions would be decided. And previously there had been a so-called deference, the Chevron deference, to the agencies, which are staffed by professionals with some presumed expertise, and said no, that there's no longer going to be a deference to those experts, but courts will be able to decide it. And as we've seen in recent years, courts have been weighing in on all kinds of things that had been essentially just kind of administrative or regulatory decisions earlier.
So instead of letting the unelected, unaccountable federal agency kind of technocrats decide on these different regulations, we're going to let the unelected, unaccountable courts make decisions on these regulations?
There was an ironic moment and a kind of you can't make this stuff up sense when I think it was Justice Gorsuch had to have an opinion pulled back and rewritten because he had mixed up nitrous oxide for nitrogen oxide. And they're quite different things. Nitrous oxide, as you know, is laughing gas that you might get at the dentist. And it was sort of seen as, sort of funny in that regard, but also a sort of warning sign when you let judges who might not actually know the difference, make these kinds of very detailed and expert-driven kind of decisions.
In the world that we're living in, where deep expertise on technical subject matters is kind of a requirement in order to understand the implications of regulations, I think it's ironic that the Supreme Court itself couldn't come up with the distinction between these two issues.
The other irony in the thing, of course, was that when this Chevron deference back in 1984 was first kind of formulated in an earlier case, it was actually upholding a decision by the Reagan Environmental Protection Agency, headed at the time by none other than Ann Gorsuch, mother of the Supreme Court Justice. And she was being challenged on a Clean Air Act regulation that environmentalists said didn't go far enough. And so the Supreme Court back in that day said, no, let the Reagan Environmental Protection Agency experts make the decision against the opinions of the environmental advocates. So it was at the time a conservative victory.
Oh, and how times have changed in decades later, how progressives and liberals came to rely on Chevron deference and the kind of expertise that the different federal agencies have on these matters, because they have career staff who essentially become experts in this area. And so some of the agencies implicated in this include the Federal Trade Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, the EPA, as you mentioned, the Social Security Administration, the National Labor Relations Board, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So it's a lot of federal agencies that are implicated in this decision.
Well, and if you think it's sort of an abstract, wonky legal argument, there are active cases pending that will have to now take into account this new kind of formulation. And, those include suits against the EPA rules on emissions from power plants and cars and heavy-duty vehicles. There's an Interior Department rule addressing methane emissions from oil and gas leaks. There's the SEC's new rules mandating corporate disclosure of material climate risks. So this is going to have real-world implications, quite quickly.
And speaking of the SEC, one of the rulings that came out was about the SEC's ability to have its own internal tribunals, and now overruled the SEC's ability to have those internal tribunals. And now those kind of cases will now have to be filed in the regular federal court as opposed to these specialized administrative tribunals.
Yeah, and that also has broad implications just in how rules get adjudicated and how quickly they can go into effect. One of the things that the SEC has been working on for a long time has been these rules for climate disclosure, climate risk disclosure, and they've already been held up in court cases. And so those are the kinds of things that have been marching forward in the early years of the Biden administration. Some of them never got formalized or finalized. Many of them got challenged, and now essentially they're all up for grabs.
And what are the implications for investors and business leaders in thinking about this kind of change in the overall kind of regulatory framework and environment in which they're operating?
Well, at some level, it's too early to tell exactly, but if you could just say broadly that investors have been kind of riding these tailwinds, as it were, of government policy, whether that's on climate investment and the kinds of subsidies and incentives built into the Inflation Reduction Act, and investing ahead of those things. Most of the new battery plants and EV investments and whatnot were not done, despite what some folks might think, because of the federal money. There was the promise of federal money that mostly hasn't even been spent yet, but it was the private investment coming in and saying, hey, there's going to be a big market in EVs. I should get into the battery business. And if you don't believe that the federal incentives will ever actually play out, because now they're going to be held up in court and challenged and delayed and stripped away, then you might not put that investment down for that new battery plant. And so a lot of the tailwinds have become headwinds.
Now, David, earlier this week, you and our colleague Lindley Browning had a piece in ImpactAlpha about the vibe shifts happening as impact investors kind of anticipate the political risk of the U.S. presidential politics. Taking as a starting point the recent U.S. SIF conference, can you tell us a little bit about the U.S. SIF and what the vibes were at that conference?
Well, it was just the latest, and it happened to sort of coincide with some of these decisions that we've been talking about. But US SIF is the Sustainable Investment Forum. They track the scale and the growth of sustainable investing over time. There's something like $8.4 trillion by their new and revised accounting of sustainable investing. So at some level, folks should have felt good about the trajectory of this kind of field that we've been building or for the last several years. But in fact, the anxiety was quite high about the political risks. Even before, you mentioned the immunity decision and the election and, the debate, which we're not going to get into here. But even before all of this, recent news, folks like Ian Bremmer at Eurasia Group were counting the U.S. presidential election this year as the world's biggest political risk, in the sense of the uncertainty of where U.S. policy might go, and that the dysfunction, in terms of things like raising the debt limit or passing a budget, much less staying the course on climate and other things, just made the U.S. kind of a wild card in the global economy. And I would say that if anything, those risks have gone up recently.
Let's get into some specific risks because we've talked a lot about on this podcast the Inflation Reduction Act and the various incentives, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a $27 billion so-called national green bank. And what are the kind of implications of the latest kind of political risk on these specific policies?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is in the crosshairs of a lot of these lawsuits that we've been talking about. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, as you mentioned, is part of that. It's a way to sort of jumpstart what people have called a green bank. It's not as like a single bank, but it's a distributed set of financing mechanisms to drive heat pumps and EVs and solar chargers and energy retrofits and water projects, all of which are greenhouse gas reducing projects, and to also make sure that they specifically reach low income neighborhoods, which have generally been left out of some of these climate transition kind of projects. And so that money has been, there was a whole awards process that ImpactAlpha covered. And now for the last month or so, the EPA has been negotiating the contracts with the winners of those awards, coalitions of kind of community lenders and state level green banks. And those contracts are anticipated to be signed sometime this month of July, and money could start flowing later in the fall. So that's a good example of a kind of project that had been building up a serious head of steam that now faces, as we said, headwinds.
All right, so this is quite concerning to me. So I just want to clarify: is there a possibility that Republicans can use the Congressional Review Act to, roll back some of the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or is that fairly airtight, legally speaking, because they are federal contracts that are being signed in the next month or so?
Well, we've been trying to get to the bottom of that very question, and I would say that there's a mixture of opinions. There's very specific situations in which that Congressional Review Act can be used, and so deadlines and protocols and whatnot. So I don't want to opine on the particulars of it. I will just say that nothing is done till it's done. Till that contract is signed and those checks are cut, there's lots of ways for inventive troublemakers to slow things down. So everybody is watching very closely, and I would say that one of the strategies that has sort of gotten a lot of attention in this last week is literally, like as you said, safeguarding and kind of locking down hard-won gains before they can be reversed.
What does this all mean for the broader narrative and the vibe that we're living under for sustainable finance and impact investing? Do these amount to big headwinds, or is it a natural pushback in a broader movement of forward momentum of actually building out the clean and renewable and inclusive economy that we've been covering for so many years?
Well, it's always risky to try to capture the zeitgeist, in a moment, and certainly in a hot take in the heat of events. So the to be sure, the cautious note is, the stock market is rising, and investment will be fine, and some business leaders like the way things are going for reasons that you can imagine, and so is the sky going to fall immediately because of this? You don't want to necessarily get branded an alarmist. On the other hand, the direction of travel of ever falling, solar prices and battery charges and ever increasing deployments of renewable energy, and the great shift in the automobile industry towards EVs. Those are all have to happen over many years with consistent investment strategies. And when those things get disrupted, that nothing is inevitable about how those transitions will play out. Now, we had sort of enumerated, you mentioned the SIF conference, sort of pulling from things that we had heard. So we had identified a number of strategies that impact investors seem to be taking, as they navigate this kind of turbulence. The first, of course, is just stay focused on those long-term trends and the positive results. I mean, if we believe the alpha and impact thesis, then the ever cheaper renewable energy, is going to win out, in some level, regardless of the regulations, and the good investments at some level were made regardless of the regulations. There is a chance for, elusive bipartisan progress. Many of these battery plants and EV plants have been in red states. It's been well noted that, red state governors may not like the Inflation Reduction Act or or climate talk, but they certainly like jobs, and their voters and constituents do as well. To that point, a popular constituency for sustainability and inclusion, there is polling evidence, we just had it in the brief this week, that folks are overwhelmingly in support of climate resilience and sort of safeguarding their neighborhoods and communities from wildfires and floods and that sort of thing. And so there's an ability, again, to forge, just practical solutions that aren't really particularly ideological. And then, as I said, the other one is just what's going on now, a wholesale kind of sprint to lock down some of these hard-won gains before they're reversed.
So the direction of travel is clear, that we are moving forward to a more inclusive and sustainable financial market system. It just might be take longer to get there, and some more bumps along the way.
Well, everything comes true in the long term. And the question, as you say, is how long that long term is.
So what do people who care about this, let's call them agents of impact, what do they need to do to kind of help shift the narrative, the overall meta narrative here? Because I do feel like sometimes we talk our own book a little bit too much, and we get involved in our own kind of internal focus on terminology and clunky definitions, and the concerns about greenwashing and impact washing and all these other things that kind of we kind of lose the plot, and we lose the broader thread. And so how do we kind of make this type of investing and this approach to investing, accessible to, let's call them, the normies out there, just regular people living their lives?
Yeah, I think that is the question. And maybe it's a little bit like shutting the barn door after the cow is gone, but there has been a consistent need to make sure that not only broad citizenry, but broad investors, see the long-term benefits of this kind of shift towards sustainability and inclusion, that those are kind of protectors, risk mitigants of a very volatile global and national economy, and that over time, as we said, that they prove out as better investments, better for your pension benefits, better for your 401k, better for your children's health, better for your neighborhood's vitality, better for your ability to get a mortgage and buy a home. These are kind of things that are, impact investing, sustainable investing mainstays. And it always has seemed to me that they should be both broadly popular in the citizenry, broadly popular among investors, and that politicians should be scrambling to get in front of this parade and lead it. And I think what that sort of, just to get to your question, I think it's a leadership moment. I think it's a time for folks who understand these kind of longer term trends and these broader dynamics to speak out what really amounts to a pro-business agenda these days, what really amounts to a social compact that we all can live with, that actually creates an environment for businesses to thrive. What are these long-term risks that that we've mentioned a little bit on this call, but also what are the long-term opportunities that everybody should get behind it if we could only kind of learn to work together.
All right. Well, now that we've zoomed out, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll zoom in to Baltimore, where a housing developer is looking to flip vacant housing stock into a community wealth building opportunity.
I'm Eric Carmen Gonzalez, ImpactAlpha's Director of Subscription Growth. Ever feel like there's so much happening it's hard to keep up? We hear you. That's why we created ImpactAlpha Latin America, a monthly newsletter for impact investors who want to keep their eye on trends and investments happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. Follow the money and connect with agents of impact powering Latin America's impact economy. Visit our Instagram page @ImpactAlpha and click on the link in our bio to sign up.
Well, David, our colleague Rudy Sonatas had an interesting piece this week, part of an ongoing series he's doing on some revitalization happening in Baltimore. Can you tell us a little bit about the particular organization that he was profiling and how they are trying to flip the switch on house flipping?
Yeah, I love this, and in particular, in the light of the conversation we've been having, just to get back on the ground and talk to real homeowners and residents in neighborhoods, and also these very passionate and innovative entrepreneurs who are tackling these problems in the neighborhoods. It's just very kind of heartening and inspiring in the context of some of the other news this week. So we sent Rudy Sonatas, as you mentioned, up to Baltimore, and there was not just one, but there was a whole handful of folks who are tackling this question of both wealth building through homeownership, neighborhood revitalization, and kind of economic development more broadly. And then importantly, kind of the protection and anti-displacement of current residents in these neighborhoods as the housing stock gets rebuilt and stores come back and kind of neighborhood life resumes. What you don't want to happen is that to set in motion a cycle of gentrification that forces folks out because the places they've lived for decades have suddenly become hipster neighborhoods and very expensive. So Rudy founded an organization called Parity Homes and a terrific young entrepreneur named Bree Jones. And the problem that Bree was tackling was that some of these blocks, have beautiful old brownstones that could be revitalized into beautiful new kinds of houses. But for starters, if you're the one house on a block of abandoned buildings, that's not very appealing. And for second, as I mentioned, you can set in motion this kind of land grab that becomes gentrification. So what she did is organized whole cohort of homeowners to kind of come in together and rebuild the block together. And there's various provisions for financing the constructions, obviously, and getting folks into housing, and then protecting that from sort of being flipped by developers and speculators. And there's something like 15,000 of these beautiful old homes in this part of West Baltimore. They call it the Black Butterfly because of the way the neighborhoods kind of lay out on the west side there. And they're starting small, but they've got 40 homeowners committed to buying homes in the neighborhood, and they've been working on about a dozen homes and getting folks into place.
And it's there's a reason why these homes went vacant in the first place. So what is the broader context of the economic revitalization that's happening in West Baltimore that's allowing these homes to kind of come back to life, so to speak? And, are there, an increase in job opportunities or transportation or community development? What's happening to make this neighborhood resilient?
Well, these neighborhoods were healthy, thriving, neighborhoods some decades ago. A whole combination of things that are sort of well known, from redlining to highway projects to disinvestment in general, and a kind of hollowing out of sort of local economies has led them to be abandoned. And so these are, as they say, the homes have good bones in the sense that they're classic old brick and brownstone kind of homes, and so they're very close to business districts and other places, but they become kind of abandoned and crime-ridden over time. So the turnaround is bringing a critical mass of folks in. It helps stabilize the neighborhood. Then folks move in with businesses, and the rest happens. And this has happened in neighborhoods around the country where inner city neighborhoods that had fallen on hard times have now come back and be very desirable. And again, what we've trying to learn from all that is how you do that without it becoming a cycle of displacement that compounds the problems and leads to the next set of issues. So Baltimore could become kind of a pilot or a prototype of ways to do neighborhood revitalization without displacement.
All right, that's interesting. We'll continue to watch the story in the digital pages of ImpactAlpha
with some great photographs from Rudy, who's a terrific photographer.
Indeed, it's an interesting photo gallery that accompanies that story, so be sure to check that out. But that's going to do it for This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian.
Now, David, what's the best way for people to contact us with any feedback?
Well, Brian, they can send us their photos from their July 4th barbecues to podcast@impactalpha.com.
And you can also send us any ideas you have or feedback on the podcast in general. Thank you all so much for listening. And if you liked what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it right now. It also helps if you share it with a friend or colleague. And if you really want to help us out, be sure to rate us and give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find the show. This Week in Impact is a production of ImpactAlpha and part of the ImpactAlpha podcast network. For more exclusive stories about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join other agents of impact by subscribing to ImpactAlpha. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, the biggest firework there is, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.